There's so many questions people have on halacha, chinuch, relationships, mental health, marriage, hashkafa, and everything in between. Every 2 weeks, I discuss them with senior dayanim of the Kehilas Federation. I'm Mena Reisner, and you're listening to Asking for a Friend. Welcome back to Asking for a Friend. This is episode 5 and part 2 on marriage with the Rav. Thank you to everyone who listened, to everyone who shared it, and everyone who sent feedback. In this episode, we're going to be moving further into the longer-term challenges that can arise as life becomes more complicated, about competing responsibilities, differing expectations, boundaries with others, how to handle tension in a way that both protects the marriage and the home, and more. Please, if you are finding this series meaningful, please do subscribe and share it with other people. And if you're able to leave a 5-star review on your platform you listen on, it really does help more people discover the podcast. Thank you, Rabbi Zimmerman, for coming back in. And I'd just like to start today with quite a general question, probably touching more on hashkafa, but something that can reframe marriage issues as a whole. And that is, maybe we should look at marriage itself as a Nisayon. In other words, there's different Nisayonis one can have in life. One can have a Nisayon of, one can struggle with parnasa, one can struggle with chinuch, right? So taking chinuch, for example, if someone has a difficult child, people would understand, definitely nowadays, that you don't just throw them out the home, however difficult they're being. There's always a certain love you should show. Maybe they'll come back. You do everything humanely possible. Why would marriage be different? Or is marriage different? Perhaps it's a Nisayon that a person, Nebuch sometimes has to have a difficult marriage, and divorce is something that should be so off the scope of what is possible. It shouldn't be something that divorce is the way out, or this is a person's Nisayon in life.
Everything in life is a Nisayon, so I imagine marriage is no difference. The Torah does write Parasha of Gerushin, and sometimes our question in life is, what is this a Nisayon for? What is Hashem expecting from me in this situation? Like I described last time, I don't know people that get divorced easily just because they're unhappy and let's just switch in life. I've never met such a person. It's popular to create such a stereotype, but I've never met the stereotype. And therefore, the question needs to be decided. It might be a Nisayon, but what am I supposed to do with this Nisayon? Am I supposed to work on it? Or no, the cost is too great. It's harming my children. It's harming my mental health. And therefore, one cannot just simply say that everything is a Nisayon and therefore it has one solution, because Nisayonis itself are meant to test us to do the right thing. But what is the right thing? A person has to seek das Torah on it.
So moving on to more day-to-day questions in marriage. Many men and women today devote enormous time and energy to chesed organizations, communal causes. That is definitely a difference nowadays to the olden days. There's been an explosion of different types of organizations. How should that responsibility be balanced against the responsibility that one has to one's spouse, especially when the times can compete with each other?
So, first of all, let's just point out, like you said, there's a tremendous explosion of chesed today, probably unprecedented in history. And the generation should be complimented on that. As to the conflict between spending time on tzarchei tzibur and on the family, so this first, before anything, there are certain people that when dealing with the tzibur, they are generous, they are merciful, they are compassionate, they have all the midas tovos in the world. And when dealing with their own family, it's the opposite. And on that, Chaim Vital says, quoted by Rav Wolbe, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to judge our midas. He's going to judge how our midas were compared vis-a-vis our spouse, not to other people. And a person who is generous and compassionate and kind to other people and not to their spouse, he says HaKadosh Baruch Hu will not give any reward to this person. I'm not sure if that means no reward on the maisa or just no reward on the midah, because we define the midah by what you do to the closest. But I don't think you're asking about that. You're asking about people who are actually kind all over. The question is, where should they devote the priority? And l'chira, the family is young, The family comes first. Just like in Hilchos Tzedakah, Aniyei Mishpachtecha comes before Aniyei Ircha, so the Tzarchei Mishpachtecha come before Tzarchei Ircha. Now you're going to ask, so then who's going to be Isaac b'Tzarchei Tzibur? And the real truth is that there's a certain time in life when people are less weighed down or bogged down by their family and have extra time. I've always felt that the real time to be Isaac b'Tzarchei Tzibur when people are middle-aged, when people are newly married and running a young family, their family needs them. When a person is very old, he has to take care of their own needs. There is a stage in life where your children grow up, or some might have left the home, some are away, and you have much more time in life. Most askanim should really come from that grouping, and one has to be careful when one is young not to cheat your family out of the time that is needed. At times, a person is being Isaac b'Tzarchei Tzibur not because he wants to help the tzibur, but because they need it for their own sibuk hanefesh. And that is a question of balance, even if your family is important, but a person needs to have a certain modicum of sibuk hanefesh, which will then make them have the chiyus to be available for their family. So that will need a balance. But as the general question in the balance, I believe when people are young, they have to invest in their family, and at a later date, they'll be available for tzarchei tzibur.
So Rob is saying this need for sibuk hanefesh, it's a legitimate desire.
It's an emotional desire. It's a normal emotion. It's part of human emotions.
So what would happen then, because I think Rob was describing before, if both spouses are pretty much on the same page, but there's a chesed life balance to discuss. What if a spouse, let's say a wife, doesn't buy into the whole chesed that he's doing, and, this is not your time now, and maybe you could do it in 15 years, and the other spouse really feels that this is their calling, whether it's the fact that they know they'd be good at a certain thing, they believe they have certain talents there, and the organization is calling him, we really need you, and he feels that, or she feels that the spouse just doesn't appreciate the talents, and that spouse feels that they have a much larger responsibility to the klal, and they look at the spouse as pulling them back and almost being selfish not to understand it.
Again, she's not being selfish on behalf of herself. She's saying that the priority is the family, because you only have a few years to raise your children, and after that, they grow up and you don't have hashpah. And be'etzem, she's right. At times, one explains to the wife, whether the husband himself or if he can't, an outsider, like I say, that this is not an issue of prioritizing the public over the family, but rather this is an issue that the person has this need, and only then can they be present for the family, and then people understand it.
So just continuing on this differences of day-to-day husband and wives, many people, when they would say, or they would define someone as a good husband, for example, they would mean that he helps at home, he baths the children, he prepares lunches, he shares the chores at home, he's spotted with the kids in the park. I think this is more common as a defining measure, possibly as a result of roles shifting, and maybe roles were more black and white back in the day. But is there any truth to the good husband, or is it a big milah of a husband who helps a lot at home? Or can a husband be 100% a good husband from a Torah view, from an ashkafic view, and he's almost never at home?
A good husband and a good father is someone who fulfills the role of a husband and a father. And the role of a father has largely been and will always remain to be a role model and to teach. The husband who's helping out is simply because women are much busier today. And therefore, it's not a question whether he's a good husband. The question is whether he's a good person. Anyone who's a mensch will, when they see someone, their wife, carrying a load, will help out. Not because of being a husband, but because of regular midas tovos. They tell a story when Reb Hillel Zaks, the Einikel of the Chafetz Chaim, later Yeshiva of Hebron, when he was learning in Lakewood as a younger man, and he once came late to Seder. And Rabbi Aaron asked him, "Why are you late?" And he said, "Listen, I was running to be on time, but I met an almana with 5 yesayimim, and she was struggling, and I had to stop to help her. And that's why I came late." And Rabbi Aaron got shooken up and said, "Who's this almana and yesayimim?" He said, "It's my wife and children, because if I wouldn't have helped them, they would have been in the same matzav and almana and yesayimim." And Rabbi Aaron laughed. But that's what we're saying. The definition of what a father should be doesn't change. The Torah does not change. The definition of what a mensch is and what midas tavis require adapt to the situation. And therefore I say this is part of chesed menschlichkeit. It's not redefining what a husband should be.
But with the fact that there has been some level of role reversal, I think it's particularly noticeable in Eretz Yisrael in America, when there's many, almost a majority of Kol Yingman's wives are professionals, they have real jobs, and in the UK I think we're a bit more behind in that, but it's very common that women are working from 9 to 5, and many times the husband is left picking up the slack of the children's appointments, the children's needs, because it might be easier for him to take a few hours off kollel than her to take off her job. So there has been, and I think that's affected the whole world, or the whole Jewish, certainly the frum world in some way, that there's a certain role reversal. Is there an issue in any way with this hashkafically? Does the Torah define distinct roles for men and women in marriage? Or is this somewhat evolved? It's a modern phenomenon and it seems to be working.
The roles in a marriage, or the spheres of influence, it says, and what does it mean, an ezer and kenegdai? Kenegdai means opposing. Now Chazal say, zacha ezer, lo zacha kenegdai. But Rav Hirsch says, al pi pshat, that you're an ezer by operating in a different sphere of influence. It's an ezer by kenegdai. It's not some people doing things together necessarily. The Gemara in Bav Metzia says, what are the roles of a husband and wife? It says, Mili Shmaya, a husband's in charge of. Mili de Besa, the wife is in charge of. Mili de Alma is 2 days in the Gemara. I always understood the answer to the 2 days is depends who's better at Mili de Alma. But Mili de Shmaya actually is the realm of the husband. Of course, Bisal Salanta said that after I divvied up with my wife, what's the Mili de Shmaya I'm in charge of, and my wife is in charge of Mili de Besa, then we constantly had a question, is this Mili de Shmaya or Mili de Besa? But the Torah has very clearly described what the Ezer Kenegdai is. There's some people, someone told me very proudly that he treats his wife equally, and on Friday night he makes Kiddush and his wife makes Hamaitzi. I don't think that's what the Torah meant when they said Ezer Kenegdai. So therefore, there are definitely roles in marriage. Now, there has been a role reversal to be able to support Limud HaTorah, where women have worked and men are learning Torah. And the question is this deleterious, or is this good, or is it just worth it for Torah learning? And personally, I don't think it's intrinsically healthy, but it's kedai, it's worth it for Torah, if the people are truly devoted to it. The primary defining factor is limud HaTorah, something that both husband and wife believe in, and she's willing, this is her greatest enjoyment in life, to give up for Torah, then it will always be successful. If people are doing it because of it's a style, or this is what society suspects, then there'll be resentment, and then it will not work. I was once by Ramosha Sternberg, so sein gesund. And he told me at that time very few people wanted to learn. And someone suggested for him a girl who said she wants to be Meisa Nefesh for Torah. And he went to the Chazon Ish and said, was Meshabeach, this young lady, that she wants to be Meisa Nefesh for Torah. And the Chazon Ish said, it's not for you. Because if she wants to be Meisa Nefesh, it means she's sacrificing, she's giving up. She's not really happy with it, but she's willing to sacrifice for a greater cause. You need a wife that is delighted with this, not that she's sacrificing for it. So someone who's delighted with it, it will be successful, because the schus HaTorah will be making and give success to everything. People that are doing it because of societal expectations, I believe it's quite unhealthy.
So that's fascinating. But talking about let's say a regular balabatish marriage, we're not talking about a younger man in kollel and a wife supporting him, but a person who goes to work and whose wife works a couple of hours in the day, and there's many times tension about the chores at home. about sleeping Shabbos afternoon as an example of tension, who gets more, you work all the week, I'm with the kids. All these little arguments that can happen about who does what in the house. Is there any direction on what to give, or must a spouse always be on the lookout to help the other?
Again, any Baal Midas will always look to help the other person. Like in the story, Hillel Zaks wanted to help the Amana. The Amana happened to be his wife. So as long as everyone is looking out to help the other person, it'll work itself out.
Right. Another phenomenon nowadays, which probably wasn't that common, is for spouses to go away without each other. It's become very common for men to go on trips. There's been a whole travel boom on going to Kvarim, which I think is for another series. And there's many women as well who could go away with a few friends and shopping, possibly to other countries. Is this healthy for marriage? Should marriage ideally create spaces that they can have their individual time? Or should all experiences want or need to be shared together?
Probably historically, there were times that men went away. I think historically, Chassidim went to the Rebbe for Yom Tov. Those that were not Chassidish felt probably that a Yom Tov should be spent with one's family.
Right. That was probably for a few weeks at a time.
Right. But that was considered a spiritual necessity. The problem, I believe, today is that it's becoming a lifestyle. This is the way we live. And I think it's not beneficial. And I'll explain to you why. There is a purpose in a vacation. You recharge, you rejuvenate, you see something else. And it's something that individuals need, but the marriage also needs it. So when everyone goes away on their own, they might get the personal recharge, but their marriage doesn't recharge. And what happens in the long run is that the marriage is the drudgery, and the vacations is when the person feels themselves. And therefore, I don't believe it's a good idea. I don't believe that it's healthy. Now, yes, sometimes a person needs their space, but there is a difference between healthy independence and emotional distancing. I remember someone told me that he wants to go on vacation alone. His wife wants to come along. So he made a deal that she can come, but she's not allowed to talk. I think that would be called emotional distancing. That would be very unhealthy. Sometimes people jointly need it. I know of a couple, during COVID, they were just on top of each other the whole time, and they made up they're not going to speak to each other till a certain hour. Like this, they should all have their own space. But when it's negotiated together and it's an understanding of each other's needs, then it's all right. When it is forced upon the other person, it is no good. But, like I said, the whole concept of vacation is the marriage also needs a vacation. The marriage also needs a recharge. And spending time together on the vacation is part of what a marriage needs.
So a person should be honest with himself, and I'm assuming it's also got to do with how many times a person feels the need to go away without a spouse, whether it is the healthy independence or it's unhealthy.
Correct.
So going back to the Rov's rule of middot, and really if you have good middot, you'll be okay in marriage. So let's say a spouse gives in for the sake of shalom bayit, the person works on their middot, which is obviously admirable. How then would someone avoid building resentment, especially if things, let's say, don't work out well as a result of them giving in? So let's say he wants to send to a certain school, or they want to go to, we could take a more minimal example, wants to go for a certain vacation, and she doesn't want to go, or she wants to go to a different place, and you know what, I'll give in for the sake of shalom bayit, and things don't work out, and you want to say, I told you so, and these are everyday stories where you just want to say, I told you so. And how does a person avoid building resentment when giving in?
We're taught the milah of Vatranus, of being mevater. But what people have to recognize, there's vitur from tzidkis, and there's vitur from a place of strength and wisdom. It's two separate things. People that vitur out of tzidkis, depending on the level of tzidkis, it'll last only as long as their tzidkis, and eventually they might bust. When someone's mevater, because they realize that he who is mevater wins. If it comes from a place of strength and wisdom, and they realize that this is better for the greater good, then they do not bust afterwards. Saying, I told you so, is just a busting. Now, we know the Vilna Gaon says, Kol rega verega she'adam bailam piv. Every second you keep your mouth quiet, you're zeicha to an oragonus. And Rabbi Lapian has a shaila, what happens if you bust at the end? Are you zeicha to the oragonus? And Rabbi Lapian says, yes, because the lashon of the Gaon is Kol rega verega. Hashem values each second. However, this might be in Bein Adam L'Makom. I'm not sure in Bein Adam L'Chaverei if you bust at the end, whether you get schar for the rega verega. But like I say, it goes to the core, is where is the Vatranus coming from? The Vatranus is, I really don't want to do it, but it's the right thing to do, and I saw in a Musa Sefer, then it will not work. If, however, a person is mevat because he understands that a Vatra never loses, or he's doing it because he feels this is better for the greater good, even though this vacation might be messed up, then they'll be happy.
How about when a person feels that they're giving in too often? In other words, is giving in always a good thing, or can it quietly damage a marriage if it becomes a pattern? If a person feels that they're constantly working on themselves, there's always differences, he's always giving in, and he sometimes wants to say, do you know what, look at me, look, I've worked on myself the past few times, maybe it's your turn to take a hit. Can it ever be unhealthy, and a person should stop and think about what's, perhaps he's become a doormat?
I think the way one would define it is one breaking the kesher of marriage. Maybe the person is acting virtuously, but they have no longer a connection because they no longer have feelings for the person. You know, of the various shalom bias cases that I've dealt with in my life, one of the most difficult that I was successful in was a couple who came in and said, we used to disagree a lot, sometimes we even fought, but we became total strangers. And we're such total strangers that we would never say a cross word one to another. It's just plain impolite to say something angrily to someone else. Now, on the face of it, there was an absence of strife, but in the depth of it, there was absolutely no marriage. And it was a big avodah how to bring them back to where they were. Just want to know the tactic behind it. You're supposed to go back to when people felt close, find out which activities they did then, or which places they went to, and then they go to that place or do that activity, and it reawakens an old feeling in them, and then they can build on that old feeling. So yes, when the Vatranus becomes part of, I'm so interested in getting along and having no strife that I don't feel connected to the person, I don't express how I'm feeling, then yes, this will damage the relationship. But when it comes from a person genuinely wants to do it because they feel that this is better for them, this is healthier for them as a unit, the two I's has become a we, and therefore it makes no difference who gave in to who, then it is a very big madrega. I was saying last time that AAA, the negative of AAA, but there's a positive also. It's called accept, adapt, and adjust. So sometimes you got to call AAA, you have to accept that these differences are always going to be, and therefore you adapt to it and you adjust to it, and then it becomes part of your happy reality.
This episode is sponsored Le'il Nishmas Reb Shmuel Zev Ben Avram, Mr. Winston Gilbert, a man who was dedicated to his family, had a real joy of living, and was devoted to tefillah, Torah learning, and yashrus. He had selfless dedication to the communities of both London and Bournemouth. He was known by many in the wider Kehillah, both young and old, as Uncle Winston, with his radiant smile and a warmth felt by all. He will be sorely missed. May his memory be a blessing, and he should be a Melitz Yosha for his wife and family and for Klal Yisrael. Another common day-to-day question would be when children complain about one parent to the other. What is the correct response that protects both chinuch and the marriage? This is probably a crossover between shalom bayis and chinuch. And is it ever appropriate to validate a child's feelings, let's say in a case where you actually believe the other parent acted poorly? So a common example would be if, let's say, a mother is looking after the children most of the day, and it comes to bedtime and she's exhausted already and the kids have been fighting for a couple of hours, and he comes home, fresh from the office, having had no contact with anyone under 10 all day, And you could see that she's reacting in a way that potentially is a result of tiredness and frustration. And the child says, well, you don't know what mommy did to me. And is it ever healthy to validate the child's feelings if you actually believe that possibly she was acting in a way that wasn't becoming? Or is it always undermining the other parent in the child's eyes?
It's like this. Be'etzem, parents are supposed to be mechabed each other, and the child should see that they respect each other, and not they're giving different messages. It says by a Ben Seir Mora, B'neinu zes, Ben Seir Mora, einenu shemeya b'koilenu. Doesn't listen to our voice. And Chazal say that Ben Seir Mora was very uncommon because ad she'eh koileseim shavos. They had to have the same voice. And it's very unlikely husband and wife have the same voice. Rav Hirsch explains that the same voice means that the parents are giving the same message to the children. He said, a Ben Seir Mora is someone whose parents give the same message to the children, and nevertheless, he rebels. But he says that if parents give different messages to the children, it's not his fault he's a Ben Seir Mora. That's what happens when people give different messages. So therefore, one is supposed to give the same message. Of course, if someone's violating the Torah, then there might be differences. But probably the key point, from what I understood from your question, that there's a difference between validating someone's feelings and criticizing their actions. You can validate a child's feelings when a child feels harmed by a parent without criticizing the action or the words of the other parent. That is acceptable, and it might be very, very wise. I'll give you an example. His father was very critical, and he used to tell his daughter the whole time, if you don't change this or you don't do this, you're never going to get married. Now, what's the wife supposed to say? So what the mother would do was that every time she was alone with her child, she would say, you know, you're such a diamond, everyone's going to be running after you in Shidduchim. She didn't say, you know, your father is wrong by saying you have to do this, or you shouldn't do this. She just recognized what is the feeling that is happening over here, the negative feeling, and erased that negative feeling without ever criticizing the other person's actions.
So had that daughter said back, but Daddy says I'll never get married,
she would have said, I know this lady. I heard it from the daughter, but I know the parents. She would have said, no, you're such a jewel.
You never say the words, no, Daddy's wrong.
Right. Again, unless sometimes people do things against the Torah, and then you have to say that they're wrong. But assuming it's within the regular bounds of marriage, where people have different ideas, and some people are stricter, and some people are more lenient, you don't say the person was wrong, but you can recognize the negative emotion that the child feels and correct that emotion without criticizing the other parent. And then you fulfill kailenu, that they're both saying the same message, but you're addressing the child's emotional needs.
So if one parent is, let's say, much stricter than the other one and has a certain rule, and that parent, in other words, that husband and wife, disagree on that rule, and the child, starts getting in between and starts trying to pit one against the other, how do you navigate that?
Well, sometimes the couple should just go to a third party, to their Rav and whatever, and say, listen, we have a difference. What should we do? And as long as they accept to abide by a third-party decision, and it doesn't make a difference what it is, it will work. So that's what the couple should be doing. If the couple doesn't do it, children will always exploit differences. They'll know who to ask. As we said, children are resilient, and unless they're suffering terribly, they'll be all right.
Right. So we've discussed a lot about tension in marriage, and that could be caused by differences between the spouses, and we've covered a lot of that. But how about when tension comes not from the couple themselves, but from interference or influence from parents and in-laws? Probably a lot of cliche mother-in-law things we could say, but it's many times all different outside influences. How should a couple navigate when a wife doesn't get on with a husband's family or vice versa without damaging either the marriage or kibbud aim, which is also a serious issue?
These are difficult questions which need to be answered on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, within Hilchos Kibbud aim, There's a difference between a son and a daughter. A daughter is meshubed, a married daughter is meshubed to her husband, while a son is not. There's a difference between parents and parents-in-law. The mitzvah in the Torah is kibbud of the aim. It says, Chayiv Adam b'chvayit chamav v'chamaisa, you're obligated to respect your parents-in-law, but the Shach says on that, kishar zakenim. The deference that you would give to an older person, you should give to your parents-in-law, even if they're young people. But it's not the same as kibbud av v'aim. Even within kibbud av v'aim, the last halacha in kibbud av v'aim, the Ramah says that if a person wants to marry a certain girl, and the parents say no, he doesn't have to listen to them. This is a Ramah b'shem the Marik. The Vilna Gaon explains this Marik, largely quoting Marik. It says there are three different reasons. One is, there is a machlokes Ramban and Rashba. It says, what is kibbud av v'aim? The Gemara says, machleyu, mashkeyu, you feed them, you take care of them, physical needs. Is there a chiyuv to listen to your parents? Your mother says, put on a scarf. Do you have to put on a scarf? Or no, it doesn't benefit her. Your father says, paint your house blue. Is there such a mitzvah? The Ramban says no, the Rashba says yes, although a secondary mitzvah. Now, obviously, in a perfect relationship, you don't look for boundaries and halachic boundaries. But the Gaon says, Me'ikeh the Dina, the Ramban is correct. And therefore, when they say, don't marry this person, that's not included in kibbud av v'aim. The second svara of the Gaon says that it's a mitzvah to get married, and a parent tells you not to do a mitzvah, you don't have to listen to them. Now, although you could argue that I can marry someone else and fulfill that mitzvah, but the Gaon understands that it's not so interchangeable. It's not like a different esrog, and it interferes with the mitzvah. The third thing the Gaon says is as follows. The mitzvah is to serve your parents food, but who pays for the food? It's the Gemara's shaila, kibbud av mishal av, ay mishal aim. Mishal av or mishal ben. And the Gemara paskins mishal av, that you're not obligated to spend money on kibbud av v'aim. The father is. So the Gaon says that if you're not mechuyev to spend money on it, al achas kama v'kama, you're not mechuyev to have tzara nefesh on it. Now, of course, these things have to be understood judiciously, and that's why I said one should apply these things on a case-by-case basis in consultant with a marital. But it's not absolute that everything a parent says, obviously when they have a good relationship, children want to do what the parents want, ask of them, and parents don't ask of children in a good relationship. But where there's a difficult relationship, then one has to know that kibbud av v'aim is like every other halacha, which has halachic boundaries, and it depends whether it's against the mitzvah, whether it's really taking care of needs, what level of distress is it causing the child. Again, people should not on their own apply this, otherwise they'll never do any mitzvahs. But one does have to be aware that in cases of great distress, one should go ask a shayla.
I think with the Rov's background and the very mini shir the Rov gave, I think people will appreciate the nuances enough to know that it's not something one could decide on by oneself. Mm-hmm. But perhaps, just as a follow-up question, how should a spouse respond when the partner speaks negatively about the parents? Let's say in a situation, or it could be without this, but let's say in a situation where a parent's behavior has genuinely caused hurt to a spouse, and that spouse is, you know what your parents did to me, and etc. And they're very pained, mm-hmm. and that person doesn't fully appreciate, maybe thinks their spouse is sensitive. Every person is somewhat biased to protect their parents. But as a general rule, how should you respond when a spouse speaks negatively?
You first have to judge this case. Was the parent totally wrong al pi Torah is one response. Parent totally right is a different response. But something like what we said before is that there's something about validating someone's feelings without agreeing to every detail of their opinion. You'd have to validate that your spouse has been hurt by this person, although you don't necessarily agree that the parent did such an avla.
It's a difficult one, though.
It is
difficult to validate without agreeing.
That is correct. But it's a skill that you have to learn because otherwise you'll always be caught in conflicts between parents, children, grandparents, parents-in-law, and one has to learn that skill. Largely in life, when you validate someone's feelings, the complaints go away. It's not really this question. People want to feel heard. People want to feel that you understand their pain and you validate it. They don't necessarily want you to change anything. Or they know it's not changeable, or they don't want you to change it, or they could live with it provided you're sympathetic to what their feelings are.
There isn't a lot of validation, particularly with these close-knit when it's families and it's very emotionally laden. Isn't it about, can't you see how much that person hurt me? How much that person who you hold of hurt me?
And but many times that's what the person is saying, but what they're saying, do you see how hurt I am?
Right.
That's really what they're saying. And if you empathize with the pain, the source of the pain, everyone realizes deep down that you can't necessarily solve everything in life.
So with all the different struggles that one can have in marriage, how much of one's marriage, if anything, is it appropriate to share with friends? Possibly more common with women who will chat about more than most men would. When is sharing healthy, and it's healthy support, and it could be validation? And when is it something that could be more damaging in the big picture to your shalom bias?
Any details which undermine the uniqueness and the special relationship between husband and wife and husband is very damaging. Obviously, you can always ask general advice. And part of marriage is loyalty to one's spouse. And therefore, when you break that loyalty, that is damaging. Besides it's damaging, many times you're seeking advice from people that you think have a perfect relationship, and adrabah, theirs is much worse, and you're causing them pain when someone complains about their spouse that they did some insignificant thing, and the person you're asking advice for you think is perfect, and it turns out they're thinking, halavai, if only I would be in that position. So besides sometimes you're harming people, anything that breaks the loyalty and the devotion of marriage is a problem. Yes, if someone has a real serious problem, one has to seek advice, but that advice has to be from a person who, A, has no negias, 2, a person that's objective with no negias, 2, a person who's a mumcha who knows what to do, and 3, that person is discreet. If it's going to come out in the next conversation or the next share or whatever, then that is the wrong person.
Right, and that's, like we said, about venting to friends. But what about struggles with a spouse? Is complete openness always something we should strive for in a marriage, and that's always the healthiest thing? Or are there thoughts, frustrations, struggles that are sometimes better processed privately rather than always shared with one spouse?
You know, Bisol Salanta said, as sheker tormen nit sagen, aber emes muss man nit sagen. You know, you're not allowed to lie, but doesn't mean you always have to tell the truth. He said this about all human relationships. When it comes to marriage, Chazal say, mutter l'shanois b'fnei darkei shalom, that sometimes you're allowed to alter things because of darkei shalom, because of shalom bias. You see, HaKadosh Baruch Hu even changed the message that Sarah said, that she spoke about herself and not about Avram Avinu. There happens to be a machlekes achreinim. It says mutter l'shanois, which is to alter. Is it mutter l'shaker also? The Aruch LaNer is not so sure about it, but the world at large feels that just like it's mutter l'shanois, it's mutter l'shaker. So if we're talking about that in general human relationships, you're not supposed to always say the truth. And when it comes to marriage, many times there's a heter or even a mitzvah not to say the truth. So I think one could figure out from that constant openness for the sake of openness is not probably the wisest course in life.
Why does the Rav think that's the case? That specifically by marriage we have, because as we know, Hashem Elokechem Emes. Emes is a very strong thing in Yiddishkeit, and we say Hashem's name is Emes. Why therefore would the Rav think would be allowed to change in marriage?
The Gemara Makis says that you're allowed to be moichik the Shem Hashem for shalom bayis, by the case of the Saita. Zak the marital, why are you allowed to do that? Shem Hashem. So he says that the Shem Hashem is shalom. And therefore you're not being meichik to Shem Hashem when
you're trying to create shalom.
When you're creating shalom, this is not being meichik the Shem Hashem. You're supporting the Shem Hashem. Don't mean to correct you, but the Shem Hashem is not emes. Chesed shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu is emes. But the Shem Hashem is shalom, and therefore shalom takes precedence over emes.
That's a beautiful answer. When a wife, let's say, begins to look down on her husband because of his, his earning ability, or let's say if he's in kollel and he can't get a stella or he can't get a position, and probably mostly due to comparisons against his or her peers, how serious is that for a marriage, and how should that dynamic be understood? I mean, ditto the case would be for a husband if he feels like his wife can't cope with the tasks that he would expect, or perhaps needs more of him than he believes other women would. Respect is obviously a very important word and a very important idea in marriage. How do couples navigate it when they just feel that they are not respecting their spouse?
The answer is that respect comes from focusing on the other person's malus. Everyone has certain malus, and that's what one should focus on. You're correct. If you focus on the chesed, you probably won't respect the person. So the antidote to that is focusing on the malus, which will always then create the respect. Sometimes if one thinks into it, let's say the husband's earning or professional status, you should know all this is really bashert. Panasa comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's really nothing to do with the husband. It's exera. Sometimes it appears to be the person's traits, but it's not really so. And therefore, one has to sometimes accept that things are Mena Reisner. When you're talking about, let's say, the wife can't cope with basic tasks, so just hire someone to do it. I don't understand. Many times people come to me, my wife can't manage, doesn't keep the house clean or whatever. So I said, so what's the problem? So hire someone to clean the house. That's what you got married for, to have a cleaning lady? But my mother used to clean the house. I said, so your mother cleaned the house, and that's very nice. But so she couldn't. None of that. Anything that you could hire someone for has nothing to do with marriage. That's just a worker. So focus on each other's milas. Focus on creating this unique relationship in which you care for each other, devoted to each other, and hence will respect each other. Most other things can be subcontracted, and they won't even affect the marriage. Plain nonsense that people are concerned about something that could be replaced. You're not a good cook. You live in Golders Green. You can walk out on the street and there's bunches of competing stores with food in them. That's not a problem.
And then we could go back to the previous question that you don't even need to tell her that.
Yeah.
So this was actually a question that was sent in, which is that there's a common piece of advice given to chassanim. Never go to sleep while upset with one another. Would the Rav say that's actually a wise thing to teach, or are there times when pausing a disagreement and revisiting it later is the healthier choice? Is an upset that unhealthy to hang in the air, or is it potentially equally unhealthy that everything has to be sorted out straight away and chas v'shalom there should be any disagreement or any tension?
The concept is a good point. The concept is don't let problems fester, but deal with them. This particular advice, whether it's wise or not, largely depends on the personality of the people involved. There are people that are noyach l'chos for noyach l'ratzos. There are other people that are kosher l'ratzos. There are some people, when things pass overnight, it goes deeper into them and the resentment is greater. There is other people that the next morning things don't feel all that important anyway. There are some people that when they're tired, they're irrational. And when they're very tired, they're even more irrational. So therefore, if you have a person who generally by the next morning it won't be important, and at this moment it seems all important, so it's probably very bad advice that the chassanim are being given. And and by other people, it is a good idea. I heard a young man speak at a Sheva Brachas recently, young in years, but old in wisdom. And he was saying, of course, in jest, that they say, don't ever go to sleep angry, stay up. He said, but you do have to know the Gemara says, Shua shla ishan gimel yamim. If a person says, I won't sleep for 3 days, he gets malchus because it's impossible to go 3 nights without sleeping. So I believe this is totally circumstantial. I agree with the underlying concept that problems should not fester, but because they grow, they don't disappear. It so happens to be in this particular permutation, it largely depends on the personality of people.
So perhaps just as a question to wrap this up, and it really takes us back to the beginning. This doesn't mean we're finishing talking about marriage on these series. We're going to compile the list of questions that have come in as feedback and Mitzvah revisit it. But as I said, just to wrap it up, would the Rav say we're preparing people properly for marriage? For marriage these days, and I'm talking about a lifetime of marriage, or is there more focus on early adjustment of possibly teaching chasanim and malus about the differences that they should just be able to get on? And either way, what foundations should be put in place before marriage to give shalom bayis the best chance over the decades that you have together?
You know, they say in real estate there's only 3 things that count: location, location, location. So you have to know in marriage there's only 3 things that count, which is middot, middot, and middot. The well-known malbim that Avraham Avinu said, go back to my family to look for a shidduch. Now, what was so illustrious about the family? They were Ivdei Avodah Zarah, Apikarsim, and the like. And the Malbim says that hashkafas aren't genetic, but midas are. And therefore, you can have a father, a Besuel, or a father, a Lavan, and they can have a daughter from the Imaz. But a person with bad midas, and that's how they raised the house, this will be inculcated into the child. So ultimately, that is going to be the long-term predictor of the health of marriage. I used to teach in our Sameach. I used to tell my students there that you might be attracted to the appearance. You're going to marry the personality, but you're going to live with the character. So make sure what you live with is good. Preparing people for marriage, if the ikar is midas, as we quoted in Matisyahu, this is a lifetime of preparation. It's not when there's a chasan. Yes, one has to teach chasanim and kalas the differences between men and women. Sometimes people ask if we would prepare them better, would there be, let's say, less divorces? And the answer is absolutely not, because most divorces happen from things that you can't prepare for. You're talking about deep-seated midas problems, addictions, all types of abuse. That's not what you can prepare people for. You can only prepare for a regular life. There's an additional practical difficulty is that when you're teaching a chassan or a kala, they're very distracted. They don't have all that much headspace. A very accomplished kala teacher told me that a mother called her up and said, you're teaching my daughter? Teach her about fiscal responsibility, because she spends money right and left. She's a real spendthrift. And the kala teacher said, listen, if you didn't teach her in the past 20-odd years, I'm not going to teach her in these few months. Besides that, she's totally distracted. And if you can just get in the main halachas with a few proper hashkafas, that is good enough. So therefore, the truth is that people are very distracted, and there's very limited what you could teach people. It would be more practical, and it's becoming increasingly popular, to tell chasanim and kalas to come back 3 months after their marriage and have a discussion with their mentor. How is marriage going and the like? Because at that time, they know more what it is we're talking about, the medvarm amurim, and they're in a better space to accept advice. But largely, the barring outside things, as I said last time, 2 givers is going to be a happy marriage. And as Chazal tell us, ish ve'isha, if a husband and wife conduct themselves properly, shchina b'neim, the shchina will be with them, there'll be shchina in their house, and yiratzen, everyone should put in their efforts, and even in the schus of just thinking about it, contemplating it, reading things about shalom bayis, hearing things about shalom bayis, everyone should be zeicha to find the Shechina in their house.
Thank you very much. That's another fantastic episode and a lot of food for thought. And we invite all your questions, which we will discuss in an upcoming episode, to podcasts@federation.org.uk. Thank you for listening, and if you found these episodes helpful and interesting, please do feel free to share and give it a 5-star review. Thank you.